Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The tablet had been hidden for times, buried beneath layers of dust, forgotten recollections and deliberate silence, yet the moment Phyllis's fritters brushed against its worn leather chine, commodity inside her fractured beyond form, as if her instincts had been screaming each on and she had eventually stumbled upon the evidence she no way wanted to find, because this wasn't just a collection of notes or business records or pointless signatures. This was a confession written sluggishly, methodically, and without guilt, a chronicle of calculated manipulation that stretched across decades of pain in Genoa City. And as she flipped through the runners with pulsing hands, her breath growing shallow, the consummation actualized that Victor Newman hadn't simply orchestrated commercial wars or particular vendettas, but had designedly steered lives toward ruin while watching from the murk, and worst of all, he'd proved everything as if it were a game worth recording, every shattered relationship, every treason, every tragedy neatly entered in essay, including moments Phyllis herself flashed back with raw clarity, moments she had criticized on fate or bad luck or her own freakishness, now laid bare as purposeful issues designed by a man who believed control was synonymous with power. And as the weight of the verity crashed down on her, Phyllis felt the room spin, her vision blurring as gashes barred down her face, because buried within those runners were references to the smallest points of her life, subtle manipulations that had pushed her toward insulation, paranoia, and despair, moments where a rumored scuttlebutt, a blurted secret, or impeccably timed treason had been nudged into actuality by Victor's unnoticeable hand, and the atrocity of it all wasn't just that he'd done it, but that he'd done it while pretending to be above similar insignificancy, presenting himself as a man of principle while reducing everyone differently to chess pieces. And as Phyllis collapsed into a president, clinging the tablet to her casket like a crack she couldn't loyal, the wrathfulness surged through her modes hotter than any heartache she had ever known, because this wasn't just about her. This was about families torn piecemeal, about trust poisoned beyond form, about a megacity that had intentionally lived under the rule of a man who believed consequences were for other people. And when she eventually brazened Victor, the air between them crepitated with a pressure so thick it felt suffocating, her grief erupting into rage as she hurled the tablet onto the table between them, runners fluttering open like ruinous substantiation refusing to stay retired. And in that moment, words failed her because no explanation could justify what she had read, no vindication could soften the verity that Victor had deliberately destroyed lives, and recorded it all with nipping detachment. And when the gashes revealed over again, it wasn't weakness that drove her but the unsupportable weight of treason, the consummation that someone she had battled, bargained with, and sometimes trusted had been still scripting her downfall for times. And the poke came not from impulse but from a place of profound violation, her hand striking his face with the force of every taradiddle, every manipulation, every insomniac night she had endured without knowing why the world sounded determined to break her. And indeed, as Victor absorbed the blow without recoiling, there was commodity unmistakable in his eyes, not lament, not shame, but recognition that the game had eventually been exposed, and that knowledge alone shattered Phyllis further because it verified what she stressed most, that Victor Newman had no way intended to stop, had no way believed himself wrong, and that the tablet wasn't an admission of guilt but a monument to his own sense of supremacy. And as Phyllis stood there shaking, gashes streaming down her face, her heart pounding with a blend of fury and grief, she understood that this disclosure would not just change her relationship with Victor but would shoot shockwaves through Genoa City, unraveling alliances, continuing old injuries, and forcing everyone to defy the uncomfortable verity that the tragedies they had survived weren't arbitrary acts of fate, but the calculated issues of a man who believed control justified atrocity. And in that ruinous moment, Phyllis realized that the tablet wasn't the end of the story but the morning of a reckoning that would leave no bone untouched. In the fate of that battle, the weight of what Phyllis had uncovered didn't lessen but rather grew heavier with every fleeting hour, settling into her bones like a sickness that refused to be cured, because once the verity had been exposed, it couldn't be unseen, and the tablet came a living thing in her mind, its runners replaying themselves over and over as she tried to attune her recollections with the exposures now sculpted into essay, moments she formerly believed were driven by passion, coexistence, or particular failure now revealing a darker design that burgled her of agency and quality. And as she wandered through Genoa City in a haze, She began to notice the unnoticeable scars etched into the lives around her, patterns arising where chaos had formerly sounded arbitrary, connections unraveling at just the right moment to profit Victor's interests, rivals weakened through emotional desolation before business attacks followed, suckers torn piecemeal by secrets that surfaced with uncanny timing, and the consummation actualized that the megacity itself had been shaped by a single man's preoccupation with dominance, and that knowledge filled Phyllis with a suffocating blend of rage and responsibility, because she now carried evidence that could destroy Victor's precisely cultivated tradition, yet exposing it would also crump lives formerly fragile, forcing her to defy the intimidating verity that justice frequently demanded. Contributory damage, and as the hours stretched into insomniac nights, her grief converted into resoluteness, a sharp, focused determination that refused to let the tablet come another buried secret, because silence had been Victor's topmost supporter for decades, and she'd no longer be complicit in that silence, indeed if it meant getting a target formerly again. And as she began tracing the ripple goods of the tablet's contents, she set up herself reconsidering old injuries she had no way completely healed from, backstabbings that had driven her to axis, moments where she had lashed out or tone-destructed, now reframed as responses finagled by someone who knew exactly which buttons to push and when to push them, and the demotion of that consummation burned deeper than any public reproach she had endured, because it stripped down the vision that her battles had been fought on equal ground, and in fading that imbalance, Phyllis felt both violated and liberated. Violated by the manipulation, liberated by the clarity it eventually brought, and this duality came her energy as she began still connecting blotches, cross-referencing names, dates, and events in the tablet with public records, commercial moves, and particular tragedies, each connection strengthening her conviction that Victor's conglomerate wasn't simply erected on ambition but on deliberate emotional sabotage. And as she erected together this retired history, the emotional risk boosted because every verity uncovered was accompanied by the echo of lives derailed, trust shattered, and innocence lost, and yet Victor himself remained outwardly smooth, continuing to project authority and control as if nothing had changed, which only corroborated the nipping nature of his mindset. A man so convinced of his righteousness that exposure didn't inspire guilt but computation, and Phyllis tasted that indeed now. He was conforming, anticipating the fallout, preparing countermeasures to cover himself and discredit her, because Victor no way replied emotionally, he replied strategically, and this understanding forced Phyllis to defy her own vulnerability, the reality that standing against him meant standing alone unless she chose her abettors precisely, and as she counted who could be trusted, the tablet revealed another painful verity, that numerous of the people she formerly believed had betrayed her out of malignancy or egoism had themselves been manipulated, nudged into conduct that served Victor's long game, leaving Phyllis torn between wrathfulness and empathy, between the desire for responsibility and the understanding that not all villains wore crowns, and as this internal conflict raged, she began to grasp the true compass of Victor's influence, that it wasn't confined to boardrooms or power struggles, but extended into the most intimate corners of people's lives, shaping feelings, opinions, and fates with nipping perfection, and the magnitude of that control forced Phyllis to defy an unsettling question, whether exposing the verity would actually strike Victor's power or simply reveal how deeply bedded it was, and this mistrustfulness visited her as she replayed their battle in her mind, the lack of denial, the absence of surprise, the subtle recognition in his eyes that verified he believed the tablet justified a testament rather than a concession, and that belief rankled her further than any taradiddle could have because it underlined the moral peak between them, her pain dismissed as respectable losses in his pursuit of dominance, and as she resolved to move forward, Phyllis understood that this battle would not be won through impulsive battle but through tolerance and perfection, the same tools Victor had applied for times, and embracing that strategy marked a turning point for her, a shift from response to intention, from victim to mastermind of her own response. And as she prepared to reveal the verity piece by piece, she braced herself for the ineluctable counterreaction, the attempts to discredit her, to paint her as unstable, vengeful, or obsessed, tactics she knew all too well, yet this time, she held commodity she had no way had ahead, inarguable substantiation and an imperturbable clarity of purpose, and indeed as fear dallied at the edges of her resoluteness, it was overshadowed by the knowledge that the tablet represented further than her own suffering. It represented the suffering of an entire community manipulated into believing their pain was accidental, And as Phyllis stood at the threshold of this new chapter, gashes still falling but no longer paralyzing, she accepted that exposing Victor would bring her dearly, but living with the verity buried would bring indeed more, and in that acceptance, she set up a strength forged not from revenge but from the turndown to allow her story, or anyone differently's to remain written by a man who believed power acquitted atrocity. As the days unfolded, the verity bedded in the tablet began to ply a quiet but ruinous pressure on every corner of Phyllis's life, not through public exposure yet, but through the internal reckoning that comes when reality eventually aligns with long-ignored instincts, and she set up herself reconsidering times of emotional warfare with a clarity that was both brutal and illuminating, fating how frequently she had been pushed into reactive positions, how constantly her worst moments had coincided with Victor's strategic requirements, and how consummately he'd exploited her disposition, her fidelity, and her vulnerabilities to achieve issues that served his larger docket. And this consummation didn't vindicate her of responsibility for her conduct, but it reframed them in a way that stripped Victor of the moral high ground he'd always claimed, revealing a pattern of provocation designed to make others buckle while he remained untouchable. And as Phyllis reused this, the sense of violation strengthened, because manipulation of this magnitude wasn't simply strategic but raptorial, feeding off emotional pain as a renewable resource, and she began to see how Victor's control thrived on insulation, how he assured that those he targeted were frequently discredited before they could be believed, turning licit grievances into perceived insecurity, and this understanding burned a fierce resoluteness within her to repel being reduced to a mock formerly. Again, indeed, as the emotional risk mounted, because carrying this verity alone came its own form of discipline, a heavy secret that pressed down on her casket, making every commerce feel loaded with implied stakes. And as she observed the familiar measures of Genoa City continuing as if nothing had changed, she was struck by the creepy normality of it all, the way people laughed, argued, and plotted without realizing how deeply their lives had been told by forces they no way exceeded. Too, and this dissociate boosted her urgency, because the longer the verity remained retired, the further power it retained over those it had formerly harmed, and yet Phyllis understood that exposing it recklessly would only support Victor's narrative, playing directly into his hands by allowing him to frame her as vengeful or unstable, and so she espoused a strategy of restraint, channelizing her fury into careful observation, gathering substantiation not just from the tablet but from the lived jests of others whose stories aligned too nearly to be coexistence, and as she did, the compass of Victor's manipulation expanded beyond indeed her worst fears, revealing a web of influence that extended across generations, shaping not only business issues but particular circles, marriages strained, alliances broken, battles burned at precisely the moments that served his interests stylish, and this pattern exposed the most insidious aspect of his power, that he infrequently acted directly, preferring rather to produce conditions that made others act on his behalf, allowing him to maintain presumptive deniability while reaping the benefits of chaos. And as Phyllis absorbed this, her wrathfulness stoned into commodity colder and further deliberate, a recognition that this battle would not be won through emotional battle but through sustained exposure, through forcing Victor to face a reckoning not heaped upon him all at formerly but delivered incrementally, insolvable to dismiss or contain. And this approach needed tolerance that tested her to the core, because every instinct prompted her to scream the verity from the rooftops, to demand responsibility incontinently, yet she defied, understanding that Victor thrived on battle, that he'd spent a continuance turning conflict into influence, and denying him that advantage came her quiet rebellion. And as she moved through this tone-assessed restraint, she noticed subtle shifts in Victor's jest. Small adaptations that betrayed his mindfulness that commodity abecedarian had changed, a heightened alert, a recalibration of alliances, an implied acknowledgement that Phyllis was no longer replying but watching, and this mindfulness unsettled him further than any blameworthiness could have, because Victor understood power dynamics privately, and he could smell when control was slipping, indeed if only slightly, and this pressure coddled beneath the face of their relations, unacknowledged yet unmistakable, fueling a cerebral standoff that neither was willing to escalate precociously. And as Phyllis continued making together the broader narrative of Victor's influence, she brazened a painful incongruity, that exposing him would not automatically heal the damage formerly done, that some injuries would remain open anyhow of the verity, connections fractured beyond form, trust eroded too deeply to restore, and this consummation forced her to defy her own provocations, questioning whether she sought justice, vengeance, or simply release from the burden of knowing. And in scuffling with this, she honored that her true thing wasn't Victor's destruction but the recovery of agency, her own and that of others who had intentionally lived under his shadow, and this distinction signified, because it anchored her conduct in purpose rather than impulse, allowing her to move forward without getting what Victor had always indicted her of being. And as the pressure mounted, Phyllis felt the emotional cost consolidate, the insomniac nights, the constant alert, the strain of carrying a verity too heavy to partake freely, and yet amid this prostration, she discovered a adaptability she hadn't known she held, a immutability born not of denial but of clarity, and this clarity converted her grief into resoluteness, her rage into strategy, and her fear into a measured determination to see this through anyhow of the particular cost. Because once the verity had been uncovered, returning to ignorance was no longer an option, and as she stood on the cliff of what she knew would be a long and brutal reckoning, Phyllis accepted that the tablet had changed her irrevocably, not by breaking her, but by stripping down vision she could no longer go, and in that stripping down, she set up an interpretation of herself no longer willing to be manipulated, silenced, or dismissed, a woman prepared to defy a heritage of control. With the one thing Victor could no way completely command, the verity brought into the light and applied with intention rather than rage. As Phyllis moved deeper into this new reality, the insulation came more pronounced, not because she was physically alone, but because knowing the verity created a distance that couldn't fluently be bridged, a quiet separation from those still operating under hypotheticals she now understood were false, and this separation stoned her mindfulness of how precisely Victor had curated his image over the times, how painlessly he deposited himself as the irremovable pillar of Genoa City, while still negotiating storms that left others criticized for the wreckage, and it came sorrowfully clear to Phyllis that the tablet wasn't simply a record of one's conduct but a design for how Victor viewed humanity itself, a scale where dominance justified manipulation and emotional fallout was dismissed as weakness, and this consummation boosted her grief, because it forced her to mourn not only what had been done to her, but the vision that Victor was able of moral restraint, and as she carried this understanding forward, she felt the emotional weight settle into a constant pang, a memorial that defying power came at the cost of comfort, familiarity, and occasionally indeed belonging, yet she refused to retreat, because retreat would mean surrendering to the same cycle that had enabled Victor for so long, and in this turndown, she set up herself redefining every once battle, every moment where she had been dismissed, undermined, or labeled unpredictable, fading now how those markers had served a purpose, how they had made it easier for others to overlook the validity of her pain, and this mindfulness sparked a fierce determination to reclaim her narrative, not by rewriting the history, but by refusing to let it be used against her any longer, and as the emotional fog lifted, replaced by sharp clarity, Phyllis understood that the most dangerous aspect of Victor's control wasn't his wealth or influence but his capability to move others, that resistance was futile, that he was ineluctable, and dismembering that belief needed continuity rather than spectacle, a steady exposure of verity that minced down at ineluctability until it fractured, and as she prepared herself for the long road ahead, she accepted that some would turn against her, some would misdoubt her, and some would choose silence over battle, because silence was safer, but safety had no way brought her peace, and peace was no longer her precedence, integrity was, and this shift marked a profound metamorphosis, one that didn't abolish her excrescencies but stoned her resoluteness, allowing her to stand establishment indeed as the emotional cost mounted, and in moments of quiet reflection, when prostration hovered to overwhelm her, Phyllis reminded herself that the tablet hadn't created this verity, it had simply revealed it, and that disclosure, painful as it was, had given her commodity inestimable, clarity without vision, and with that clarity came the understanding that defying Victor wasn't about winning or losing but about refusing to share in a system erected on manipulation and fear, and as she continued forward, steady despite the query ahead, she embraced the reality that exposure wasn't a single moment but a process, one that needed tolerance, courage, and an unyielding commitment to honesty, indeed when honesty came at a particular cost, and in embracing that process, Phyllis stepped completely into a part she had long defied but could no longer avoid, not simply as a survivor of Victor Newman's plots, but as a catalyst for reckoning, determined to ensure that the terrible secret behind the tablet would no longer remain buried, no matter how fiercely the murk fought to keep it retired.